Hi, Grace Church. Let's take a minute and talk about this idea of getting led astray by spiritual terrorists. I know this term spiritual terrorist may seem a bit over the top, a bit ominous maybe. Folding the word spiritual with the word terrorist doesn't seem like a natural thing, a natural connection there. But this is what's happening in our generation and in the early generation of the church, too. There are people disguised as believers of Christ hanging out in the church. And by church, I don't necessarily mean Grace Church, although it certainly can happen in our church and we always need to be on our guard, but the larger church of Christ. Let's look a little deeper at this idea of spiritual terrorists. These folks would like to destroy the gospel of Christ. Perhaps they do this by a slight twist of the gospel message or a subtle question placed about Christ and his lordship. You can spot a spiritual terrorist by listening to how they talk about Jesus and his gospel. Listen for the sleight of hand between facts and a fake message. John MacArthur, in his book, it's called The Truth War. Here it is. And it's called The Truth War. He talks about this idea of spiritual terrorists and the damage these persons can do as they inflict damage from within the church, from inside the church. These attacks are not coming from without, but from within. So listen for where these spiritual terrorists exist and where they hang out. This is what MacArthur says. He says spiritual terrorists and saboteurs within the church pose a far more serious threat than manifestly hostile forces on the outside. From the very start of the church age, all the most spiritually deadly onslaughts against the gospel have come from people pretending to be Christians, not from atheists and agnostics on the outside. So these spiritual terrorists are among the church and probably have existed there and are there right now, obviously. They've been there for a while. Again, not necessarily at Grace, although it certainly can happen and we need to be on our lookout. We need to be on our guard. Our church doors are open each week for anyone to walk through and attempt a takedown of the gospel. Well, this idea of a takedown by spiritual terrorists is not a new thing. John writes about it in this idea of theological error and false teachers. He writes about this in Revelation chapter 2. Here's what John was instructed to write. To the angel of the church in Ephesus. So this is a comment about the church in Ephesus in Revelation chapter 2. These are the words of him who told the 7 stars in the right hand and walks among the 7 golden lampstands. I know your deeds, your hard work, and your perseverance. I know that you cannot tolerate wicked men, that you have tested those who claim to be apostles, but are not, and have found them false. Verse 3, you have persevered and have endured hardship for my name, and you have not grown weary. God commended the church in Ephesus. Christ commended the church in Ephesus for their diligence in stopping false teachers, these spiritual terrorists, from polluting the gospel of Christ. You have preserved and have endured hardships for my name and have not grown weary. What an encouragement from Christ himself to be told that their church had done the hard work of enduring against those who would destroy the gospel from within the church. Grace Church, each of us has a responsibility to listen for those subtle errors in the language of apostasy. Be on the lookout for those teachers who intentionally come into our fellowship looking to take us down by destroying the gospel of Christ. To do this, though, you must know God's word. You have to be listening. You must know the gospel of Christ so that you can identify false teaching when you hear it. Join with me in persevering and enduring against spiritual terrorists by studying God's word. Okay, that's it for now. Remember, God is still on his throne. He's always been there and he's always going to be. We'll see you in church on Sunday.